When our parents left me and my little brother alone, I offered him something he couldn't deny. Something that would turn into the most exciting days of our lives. My name is Aaron, and I never imagined I'd find myself in a situation like this. Growing up, my younger brother Charles and I had a bond that felt unshakable. He was 5 years younger than me. Always the kid I looked out for. The one I protected from bullies and helped with his homework. But as we grew older, life began to pull us in different directions. I went to college and then into the workforce, while Charles was still navigating high school and figuring out who he was. Our parents were always busy, their work schedules leaving little time for family bonding. They weren't neglectful, just absent. It meant that much of the responsibility of looking after Charles fell on me. Especially once I was old enough to drive and take charge of things at home. It wasn't a burden, though. Charles was easygoing, always eager to please, and quick to smile. Being around him never felt like work. But things changed after I moved out. I was 24 now, living in a small apartment on the other side of town. I didn't visit home as often as I should have, and guilt gnawed at me whenever I thought about how much I missed in Charles's life. The carefree kid I remembered was growing into someone I barely knew. And that realization stung more than I cared to admit. One weekend, my parents announced they'd be going out of town for a business retreat, leaving Charles alone for 3 days. My mom called me, her voice tinged with worry, asking if I could come stay with him. "He's old enough to look after himself," she said, "but it would give me peace of mind to know you're there." I agreed, more out of guilt than anything else. It wasn't like I had big plans for the weekend, and maybe spending time with Charles would be a chance to reconnect. When I arrived at the house, Charles greeted me at the door with his usual lopsided grin. "Long time no see, stranger," he teased, pulling me into a quick hug. Yeah, I said, rolling my eyes but smiling. "You missed me," he laughed, stepping back to let me in. The house looked the same as always. Tidy but lived in, with the faint smell of lemon cleaner lingering in the air. It felt strange being back, like stepping into a time capsule of my teenage years. We spent the first evening catching up. Charles filled me in on school, his friends, and his plans for college, while I shared bits and pieces of my own life. It felt good to talk, to bridge the gap that had grown between us over the years. For a while, it felt like nothing had changed. But as the hours passed, I started to notice things about Charles that I hadn't before. He wasn't a kid anymore. He was taller now, his shoulders broader, his voice deeper. There was a quiet confidence about him, a maturity that hadn't been there the last time I'd really paid attention. It caught me off guard, and I found myself struggling to reconcile the image of the little brother I'd always known with the young man sitting across from me. That night, after we'd finished dinner and cleaned up the kitchen, Charles suggested watching a movie. "Something good," he said, scrolling through the options on the TV. "Not one of those boring movies you like." "Excuse me," I said, pretending to be offended. "My taste in movies is impeccable." He smirked, finally settling on a comedy we'd both seen a dozen times. As the opening credits rolled, he flopped onto the couch beside me. His long legs sprawled out as he got comfortable. For a while, it was easy to forget everything else and just enjoy the moment. We laughed at the same jokes, recited lines we knew by heart, and fell into a rhythm that felt familiar and safe. But every now and then, I'd catch Charles looking at me. Not in a way that was strange or unsettling, but with an intensity that made my stomach flutter. I told myself I was imagining it. He was my brother. After all, there was nothing unusual about the way he looked at me. Was there? When the movie ended, Charles stretched and let out a yawn. "I'm going to grab a drink," he said, standing up and heading to the kitchen. I stayed on the couch, scrolling through my phone as I waited for him to come back. But a few minutes later, I heard his voice from the kitchen. "Hey Aaron, you want something?" "Sure," I called back. "Surprise me." When he returned, he was carrying 2 glasses of soda. He handed one to me before sitting back down. Closer this time, his knee brushed against mine, and I felt a jolt of something I couldn't quite explain. "Thanks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged, taking a sip of his drink. "No problem." We sat in silence for a while, the faint hum of the TV filling the room. I tried to focus on my phone, but I could feel his presence beside me, the warmth of him so close. It was distracting in a way I wasn't prepared for, and I found myself shifting uncomfortably, unsure of what to do with the strange energy in the room. The silence stretched as we sat there on the couch, the faint glow of the television casting shadows across the room. I scrolled through my phone, pretending to focus on something, anything other than the strange energy I couldn't ignore. Charles was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, his knee brushing against mine every so often when he shifted. It was nothing, I told myself, just proximity. But the part of me that couldn't quite relax thought otherwise. "So," Charles said, suddenly breaking the quiet, "what's life like in the big city? Do you miss it here at all?" His question was casual enough, but the way his eyes fixed on mine made me hesitate. "I mean, yeah, sometimes," I replied, setting my phone down, "but it's different now. I like having my own space. You know." He nodded, leaning back against the couch. "I get that. Still, it's kind of weird not having you around all the time. The house feels quieter without you." I smiled faintly, unsure how to respond. "I miss being here sometimes," I admitted, "but things change. People grow up." "Yeah," he said, his voice softer now. "I guess they do." There was something in his tone, wistful maybe, that made my chest tighten. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, noting the way he seemed deep in thought. His brow furrowed slightly. It was a look I hadn't seen on him before, and it made him seem older somehow, more serious. For a moment, I saw him not as my little brother, but as a person in his own right, someone with his own struggles and complexities. The realization unsettled me, and I shifted slightly, breaking the moment. "Well," I said, trying to keep my tone light, "you'll be out of here soon enough. College, new friends, a whole new life." "Maybe," he said, shrugging, "but it's not the same. You're always the one I could talk to. You know, even when things were hard." "Hard?" I echoed, frowning. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor before meeting mine again. "Just after Dad started working so much and Mom was always busy. It felt like I was on my own a lot. But you were always there. You made it easier." My heart ached at his words, guilt washing over me in waves. I hadn't realized how much my absence had affected him, how much he'd relied on me without ever saying so. "I'm sorry, Charles," I said quietly. I didn't know you felt that way." He shrugged again, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's not your fault. You had your own stuff to deal with. But I'm glad you're here now." "Me too," I said, reaching out to squeeze his shoulder. "And I'm always here if you need me. You know that, right?" "Yeah," he said, his smile widening. "I know." For a moment, everything felt normal again, comfortable, easy. But as my hand lingered on his shoulder, I became acutely aware of the tension in the air. The way his gaze seemed to soften as it met mine. I pulled my hand back quickly, my cheeks flushing as I turned away. "Anyway," I said, clearing my throat, "we should probably get some sleep. It's getting late." "Yeah," he agreed, standing up and stretching. "Good idea." He headed toward the stairs, pausing at the bottom to glance back at me. "Good night, Aaron." "Good night," I replied, forcing a smile as he disappeared upstairs. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was, I turned off the TV and headed to the kitchen to rinse out my glass. The house was quiet now, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the stillness. I stared out the window for a while, watching the shadows of the trees sway in the moonlight, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't untangle. When I finally made my way to bed, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the strange tension that had settled over the house. Charles's words, his lingering looks, the way he'd spoken to me, it all felt significant, though I couldn't explain why. But I knew for a fact that something was going to happen. And later I would find out I was right. The next morning, I woke to the sound of faint music drifting up from the kitchen. I sat up, groggy and disoriented, and checked the time. It was later than I'd thought, the sun already high in the sky. I got dressed quickly and headed downstairs, following the sound of the music. Charles was in the kitchen, humming along to a song on the radio as he made breakfast. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly messy from sleep. He looked so much like the kid I used to tease and take care of. But at the same time he didn't. He was older now, more self-assured, and it caught me off guard. "Morning," he said, glancing up as I walked in. "I made eggs. Want some?" "Sure," I said, sitting down at the table. "Thanks." He set a plate in front of me and sat down across from me, his easy smile making it hard to stay in my head. For a while, we ate in companionable silence, the warmth of the sun streaming through the windows and casting a golden glow over the room. "This is nice," Charles said, suddenly breaking the quiet. "Having you here, it feels like old times." "Yeah," I said, smiling. "It does." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't the same. The comfortable familiarity of our relationship had been replaced by something I couldn't quite name. Something that made my chest tighten and my thoughts race. And as much as I tried to push it aside, I knew it wasn't going away. The morning drifted by in a haze of routine, but the underlying tension between Charles and me lingered. He seemed more relaxed than I was, humming along to the radio as he cleaned up the kitchen, while I busied myself with small tasks to avoid thinking too much. It felt like every glance, every word carried a weight I couldn't ignore. By the time lunch rolled around, I was restless. Charles suggested watching another movie. But I wasn't in the mood to sit still. "Why don't we go for a walk?" I suggested, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. Charles grinned. "Sounds good. Let me grab my shoes." We headed out into the neighborhood. The quiet streets lined with tall trees and neatly trimmed lawns. It was the kind of place that always felt the same, no matter how much time passed. We walked side by side, chatting about nothing in particular: his classes, my work, the neighbor's dog that barked at anything that moved. It felt easy again, like slipping into a rhythm we hadn't found in years. But even as we laughed and joked, I couldn't ignore the occasional way his shoulder brushed against mine, or the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But deep down I knew it wasn't. We reached the park at the end of the street. The familiar sight of the swings and the faded basketball court bringing back a rush of childhood memories. Charles sat on one of the swings, his long legs nearly touching the ground, and gestured for me to join him. I hesitated for a moment before sitting on the swing next to him, the chains creaking softly as I leaned back. "This place hasn't changed a bit," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "Yeah," I said, smiling faintly. "It feels like we spent half our childhood here." "Probably because we did," he said, laughing. "You always insisted on pushing me on the swings, even when I told you I could do it myself. Because you always jumped off and landed in the mud." I shot back, grinning. "Mom made me promise to keep you out of trouble." He chuckled, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "You were always looking out for me." "Of course," I said softly. "You're my little brother." He didn't respond right away, his expression growing thoughtful. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if Dad were around more?" His question caught me off guard, and I glanced at him, unsure how to answer. "I guess," I said finally. "But you've turned out pretty great. You know, you don't need him to be proud of you." His eyes met mine, and for a moment the vulnerability in his gaze made my chest ache. "Thanks," he said quietly. "That means a lot." We sat there in silence for a while. The sounds of the park, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, filling the space between us. It was a peaceful moment, but the tension from before still lingered just beneath the surface. Eventually, Charles stood up, brushing his hands against his jeans. "We should head back," he said. "It's starting to get chilly." "Yeah," I said, following his lead. The walk home felt longer, the quiet between us heavier now. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dancing around something neither of us knew how to address. By the time we got back to the house, I was ready to retreat to the safety of the guest room and clear my head. But Charles had other plans. "Let's play a game," he said, grinning as he grabbed the controller for the console. "Loser does the dishes tonight. You're on," I said, grateful for the distraction. For the next hour, we fell into an easy rhythm, the competitive banter and laughter easing some of the tension. Charles won most of the rounds, as he always did, but I managed to snag a victory or two, much to his dismay. By the time we finished, it felt like the strange energy from earlier had lifted, at least for a little while. "I'm still not doing the dishes," I said as we turned off the console, crossing my arms in mock defiance. "Fair enough," he said, laughing. "I'll let you off the hook this time." The rest of the evening passed quietly. We ate dinner, talked about plans for the next day, and eventually settled into our usual routines. But as the house grew quieter and the night wore on, the tension began to creep back in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building between us. Something unspoken but impossible to ignore. But later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, something unexpected happened. I heard the soft creak of the floorboards outside my room. My heart jumped, and I froze, listening intently as the footsteps grew closer. Then came the knock. "Aaron?" Charles's voice was quiet, hesitant. I sat up, my pulse racing. "Yeah? Can I come in?" he asked. I hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was late, and the house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. "What's wrong?" I asked. I need to talk to you," he said, his voice barely audible. I sighed, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. "Okay, come in." The door creaked open, and Charles stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment before crossing the room to sit at the edge of the bed. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unease twisting in my stomach. He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said finally. "About us. About how much you mean to me." His words made my heart race, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. "Charles, you're my brother," I said carefully. "Of course we mean a lot to each other. That's how family works." "It's not just that," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You've always been there for me in a way no one else has. You've always understood me, Charles." I started, but he cut me off. "I don't want to ruin anything," he said quickly, "but I need you to know how much you mean to me. I don't know what I'd do without you." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning I couldn't fully process. I stared at him, my thoughts racing as the unspoken tension between us finally came to a head. The weight of Charles's words settled heavily between us, the silence stretching far longer than it should have. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came out. His gaze stayed fixed on me, vulnerable and searching, and I could feel the walls I'd carefully built over the years beginning to crack. "Charles," I said finally, my voice soft but firm, "I don't think you realize how hard this is for me to hear." He frowned, his brows furrowing as he shook his head. "I'm not trying to make things harder for you," he said. I needed to say it. To get it out." I exhaled deeply, running a hand through my hair as I tried to gather my thoughts. "You mean a lot to me too," I said carefully. "But we're siblings, Charles. We've always looked out for each other because that's what family does." "It's more than that," he said, his voice trembling. "You know it is." I shook my head, my chest tightening. "You're just confused," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "We've both been through a lot, especially with Mom and Dad being gone so much. It's natural to feel closer because of that. It's not confusion," he said, his voice steadier now. "It's how I feel, and I know it's not normal. But I can't pretend it doesn't exist." I stood up from the bed, pacing the small room as I tried to process everything. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, torn between wanting to comfort him and the undeniable sense that something had gone terribly wrong. "Charles," I said, turning to face him, "we can't keep talking like this. It's not fair to either of us." His expression faltered, a flicker of hurt crossing his face. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I just needed you to know. The raw honesty in his voice left me speechless. I sat back down on the bed, my shoulders slumping as the weight of the situation bore down on me. "I don't know what to say," I admitted quietly. "You don't have to say anything," he said. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. The room felt suffocating, the tension almost palpable. I wanted to fix things, to make everything go back to the way it was before. But I didn't know how. "We need to find a way to move past this," I said finally. "You're my brother, Charles. That's never going to change." He nodded slowly, though his expression remained conflicted. "I don't want to lose you," he said. "You're the only one who really gets me." "You're not going to lose me," I said firmly. "But we need to set boundaries. This isn't something we can dwell on." The silence that followed was heavy but necessary. Charles stood up after a moment, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "I know," I said, my tone soft. "And I'm not upset with you. But we need to be careful, Charles, for both our sakes." He nodded again, lingering by the door for a moment before finally stepping out. The soft click of the door shutting behind him felt like a release. But the tension in my chest didn't ease. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty room and trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. And I don't know how, but I just knew that something was about to happen between us. I could feel it. The next morning was quiet. The atmosphere in the house noticeably different. Charles didn't join me for breakfast, and I didn't press him. I told myself he needed space, just as much as I did, and that things would settle with time. But as the day wore on, the silence between us became harder to bear. By the afternoon, I decided to try breaking the ice. I found him in his room, sitting on the edge of his bed with his headphones on. He looked up when I knocked, pulling the headphones off and offering a small, hesitant smile. "Hey," I said, stepping inside. "How are you holding up?" He shrugged, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I'm fine." I sat down beside him, leaving enough space between us to feel comfortable. "I know things are weird right now," I said, "but I want us to figure this out. I don't want there to be tension between us." "I don't either," he said quietly, "but I don't know how to fix it." "We'll figure it out," I said, offering a reassuring smile. "It's going to take time, but we'll get there." He glanced at me, his expression softening. "Thanks," he said, "for not freaking out. I'm your brother," I said simply. "I'll always have your back." The tension eased slightly, and for the first time in what felt like days, I felt a glimmer of hope. We talked for a while longer, steering the conversation toward lighter topics, school, friends, and the upcoming weekend. By the time I left his room, the weight on my chest had lifted, if only slightly. But as the house grew quiet again that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't truly resolved. Charles's words, his emotions, and the undeniable intensity of the past few days stayed with me, leaving me restless and uncertain. And as much as I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew this was far from over. The house was silent that night, but my mind was anything but. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts churning. Charles's words from earlier replayed in my head, his vulnerability, his honesty, the weight of everything he'd admitted. I told myself things would go back to normal, that this was just a bump in the road. But deep down I wasn't sure. And then it happened. Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. My chest tightened as they drew closer, stopping just outside my door. I sat up, holding my breath as I waited. Then came the knock, quiet and hesitant, just like the night before. "Aaron?" Charles's voice was barely audible. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. "Yeah? Can I come in?" My heart raced as I hesitated. Glancing at the clock, it was late, and the house was dark and quiet. But I couldn't bring myself to turn him away again. I asked. There was a silence for a second. "Okay," I said softly. "Come in." The door creaked open, and Charles stepped inside. He looked nervous, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched. He closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment before crossing the room to sit at the edge of the bed. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I shouldn't be here." "It's okay," I said quickly, though my pulse was racing. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor. I've been thinking a lot about what I said earlier. And I'm scared I messed everything up." "You didn't," I said firmly, leaning forward. "Charles, I told you we'll figure this out. But it's going to take time." "I know," he said, his voice trembling. "But it's hard. I feel like I'm stuck in my own head. And I don't know how to get out." I placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. "You're not alone," I said. "We'll get through this together." He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine, and the intensity in his gaze made my chest tighten. "You've always been there for me," he said softly, "even when no one else was. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You don't have to think about that," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken emotions I didn't know how to navigate. Charles's expression was raw, vulnerable in a way I had never seen before, and it left me at a loss for words. "I just want things to be okay again," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said, my own voice trembling now. "But we need to set boundaries. Charles, this isn't something we can let take over." He nodded slowly, though his expression was conflicted. "I know," he said. "I'm trying." "I know you are," I said, my voice softer now. "And that's what matters." The tension in the room shifted slightly. Not disappearing but settling into something less suffocating. Charles didn't stand to leave as I'd expected. Instead, he lingered, his eyes searching mine as though trying to find something. Something he couldn't quite name. "Charles," I said after a moment, my voice quiet but steady. "We can't keep circling around this. It's not healthy for either of us." "I know," he said again, his tone almost a whisper. "But I don't know how to let it go." His honesty was disarming, and I found myself leaning forward slightly, as if closing the physical space between us might somehow bridge the emotional gap as well. "Maybe," I said carefully, "you need to face it head on." He frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, my heart pounding as I considered my words. "Sometimes," I said slowly, "the only way to move past something is to stop running from it. To acknowledge it fully." His gaze held mine, his brow furrowing as he processed what I was saying. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying," I interrupted gently, "that maybe you need to stop bottling everything up. To let yourself feel it so you can finally let it go." His eyes widened slightly, realization dawning on him. Aaron. It's okay, I said softly, reaching out to place a hand on his. It's just a moment, nothing more. He didn't move for a long moment. His gaze locked on mine, the weight of the room pressing down on us. And then, tentatively, he leaned in. Our lips met briefly, just the lightest brush, tentative and filled with the weight of unspoken emotions. It was over almost as quickly as it began, leaving the air between us heavy with silence. Charles pulled back, his expression a mixture of shock and uncertainty. I'm sorry, he stammered, his voice trembling. I didn't mean. No, Charles, don't worry. I offered it myself, I said. He looked me in the eyes for a second, not saying anything. Damn, I had quite a handsome brother. I quite liked it. I continued. Do it again. With a little hesitation, he leaned in again and we kissed once again. This time heavier, as if we were both experimenting with what the lines were. Eventually, we stopped for a second, and I moved my hand to a certain place, initiating something way beyond the boundaries. Full of disbelief, he looked me in my eyes. And without a word, I did it. I went further. We both went further. And what we did was crazy, I have to admit, but it was good. So good. It was amazing. Eventually, when we both had finished, we lay down there, realizing what had just happened. Wow, Charles said, breaking the silence. I don't know what to think of it. Honestly. It's okay, I said quickly, cutting him off. It's done now. We can move forward. He looked at me, his eyes filled with questions. But he didn't say anything. Slowly, he stood, his movements careful, as though afraid to disturb the fragile peace we'd found. Good night, Aaron, he said quietly. Good night, I replied, watching as he left the room. When the door clicked shut behind him, I let out a shaky breath, my thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. The moment had been fleeting, but it felt significant, a line crossed, but perhaps one that would allow us both to find clarity. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope that we could navigate it together. The next morning, the house felt lighter somehow. Charles joined me for breakfast, his demeanor more relaxed than it had been in days. We talked about plans for the day. The conversation easy and comfortable. It felt like a step in the right direction, and I clung to that hope as the hours passed. When it was finally time for me to leave, Charles walked me to the door. Josh wasn't home yet, but that felt like a blessing in disguise. This was something I needed to handle on my own. Thanks for staying, Charles said, his smile soft but genuine. It meant a lot. I'm glad I did, I said, and I'll be back soon. Okay? We'll keep talking. We'll figure it out. He nodded, his expression hopeful. Yeah, we will. As I drove away, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror. But the weight of everything that had happened stayed with me. The days ahead would be difficult, I knew, but for the first time in a while, I felt like we were on the right path. And that was enough. Back at my apartment, life resumed its usual rhythm. But the memory of that night stayed with me. I found myself thinking about Charles more often than I cared to admit. Wondering how he was coping. Whether he had found the clarity he needed. A few weeks later, he texted me, "Hey, just wanted to say thanks again. Things feel clearer now. I'm doing okay." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "I'm glad. Take it one step at a time. Okay? I'm always here if you need me." His response was simple: "I know. I'll be fine." It wasn't closure. Not exactly. But it was a step forward. And for now, that was enough. Still, till this day, I am not so sure what to think of it. I'm curious what other people think of it. Is it okay what I have done? What we have done? Should I feel guilty? Please let me know in the comments. It would help me a lot. Thank you.